On Tuesday, we talked about the process of naming and categorizing animals. Okay, so we talked about what is a species. That's sort of like the general, most fundamental unit of zoology, right? When you go to a zoo and you see the little markers on the cages and the tanks, it's describing the species that are there. When we talk about what animals are protected, we talk about species, right? The Endangered Species Act, right? So we talked about in those lectures, which you can watch that are recorded, how do you define a species? How are they named, right? And how are they grouped into genera? How are they grouped into families? How are they grouped? So on and so forth, up into the kingdom level and the domain, okay? The lecture 2 is about this. It's really a technique, or they are things, phylogenies, but it's about understanding relatedness of species. Okay. Before Darwin, pre-Darwinian ideas are basically this, right? Where did the daisy come from? It came from a daisy. And daisies were created here, and pine trees were created there, and the polyphemus moth and the iguana is a bonobo chimp, and they're separate from each other, and they are non-changing. Okay. So the red stays red from the beginning of time until what we see now. Okay. Darwin's great contribution, the great dangerous idea that Darwin had, is that there was life. Now, one thing, this is important to note, Darwin did not say where the life came from. Darwin did not say life arose materialistically without the intervention of some supreme being. Just that the things that we see now, the organisms that we see, you look out the window, you go to a museum, go to the zoo, are related to each other, right? So that the plants are more closely related to each other than they are to any of the animals, and that the invertebrates are less closely related than the two vertebrates, and that they're all related to that first living thing. Life arose once, and it has changed and split and adapted and speciated into all of the living things that we see before us now, okay? This is sort of, I mean, if you really start thinking about it, that's kind of mind-blowing, right? But the evidence is very, very strong that this is the case, okay? Evidence is all around us that this is the case, okay? So, we spend a lot of time to basically, this is a phylogeny, right? This is very useful for us to tell us how things are interrelated with each other. And we can talk about how they're useful, right? But we're going to understand how to read them and what they're used for and how generally to make them, okay? How to construct these phylogenies. One of the most important ideas in sciences, right? And I mean, there's so many ways that this is really important. I mean, take the coronavirus, for example, right now. It's changing, it's mutating, it's splitting. There's a new variant that came out of the UK. It's now taking over in the United States, right? Where did it come from? It wasn't created separate. It came from the original strand, which came from a different virus, right? Darwin, I mean, he was a lucky guy. He really had a silver spoon in his mouth, and he had a lot of time to think about this. But he figured this out. He inferred. You can see it. This is true crime story, but this is a notebook that probably the inception of this idea, right? That has changed forensics, it's changed medicine, it's changed everything that happened in science. And here's the inception of the idea. He says, I think that species D and B and C and A are all interrelated to each other, and they split and they go back to the first living thing. All right? Somebody stole this. This notebook is now missing. Dun, dun, dun. Can get a lot of money if you guys know where it is. You can return it, probably big reward. All right? But this is pretty amazing. You figured this out by traveling and by studying things like barnacle penises and studying fancy pigeons and all kinds of stuff, right? Now that, so this is not really that long. This was probably 1840s or 50s or something, just before Reinhardt started in the 1880s, right? So not that long before Reinhardt started, Darwin's like, damn, that's just. Now here's like our understanding now. This is the tree. And actually, this is an understanding probably 10 years ago, and we know how fast science moves now. But here we are. This is humans, right? One little tiny branch, and we are. This is maybe the primates, which are maybe part of the placental mammals, which are related to all of the animals, which are related to. More closely related to fungi here, which then are related to plants, all the way back to protists and archaeans in the first living thing. All right. This was constructed using an RNA sequence, something on. But we share genes in common with all these organisms, and you can reconstruct this. This is neat stuff. Puts things in perspective, right? So. That depiction, that figure, the diagram that displays these relationships is called a phylogeny, okay? And it is a visual representation of information. And that information that it visualizes it's a hypothesis about relationships, okay? It's a hypothesis about which groups are old, which groups are new. It's a hypothesis about how closely related two groups are. It's a hypothesis about, and we'll get to this, but looking at good or bad groupings. Those groupings are human constructs, like families and orders and all those kind of things, right? So why did I put hypothesis in italics here? Why the emphasis on hypothesis? Why is it important to remember that it's a hypothesis? What do you know about hypothesis? Somebody says, well, I have a hypothesis that luckily this new variant of the COVID-19, the novel coronavirus, is there's a hypothesis that the existing vaccines will still protect us from the variant. There's a hypothesis that it is more contagious because it's has a greater affinity for ACE receptors, right? But when I say there's a hypothesis, what does that tell you about the idea?
That you're only guessing it, you're not quite sure.
There's uncertainty, right? That there's uncertainty. There's various levels of uncertainty, right? Sometimes we have a hypothesis that we're very uncertain about. Other times we have a hypothesis that it all depends on how much evidence there is for the hypothesis, okay? That it's likely to change, okay? Think if you go back to March, what were all the hypotheses about this coronavirus? Was you could get it from the doorknob, you could, there was a hypothesis that it was pointless to wear masks because it's so small, it just goes right through the mask. But then what happens? It changes and evolves. We collect new evidence, we do experiments, and the hypothesis changes, right? These phylogenies are just hypotheses, varying levels of this. Look at all of the different relationships that are displayed on here. they're not all correct. There's a lot of mistakes on here. But just like every science, we got to start someplace. We collect new evidence. The relationships change, right? But they are hypotheses. So some examples here. Some things that are sort of implicitly displayed on these phylogenies. We sometimes know what's at the end of the trees, the branches, right? But when we see this, what is this? We don't know what organism this is. We're making an assumption that there was an organism that formed the common ancestor of these two organisms. This is usually not an extant species, it's usually extinct, and we usually have no idea what it is. It's kind of like the missing link, if you will, the link between this and this, okay? There's a time aspect to these phylogenies too. So the further you get from the branches, the further you go back, it's deeper and deeper in time, okay? So when you get all the way to the trunk of the tree, just like a tree, what was the first thing to grow was the trunk. And then it grew up, and maybe a year later it would put out these branches. And then a year after that, they put out those branches, so on and so forth. So by the time you get to the ends, this is recent or modern times, this is going back further and further in time, okay? So this ancestor was shared by all three, but it was shared more distantly than this ancestor. So therefore, who are the two closest relatives on this phylogeny? Yeah, monkeys and apes, right? They are more closely related because they share a more recent common ancestor in this hypothetical organism. Now you probably, I wish I could get inside your head. So this is probably totally clear to you, right? But it's not. Always ask questions. This is kind of important. This is to me an important point, where we would be here on this branch here, right? Are we related to gorillas? Yes. Are we related to reindeer? Yes. Are we related to plants? Yes. Are we related to bacteria? Yes. Way, way back in time. Are we? Is an ape? Did an ape evolve from a monkey? Did a monkey evolve from a reindeer? This one of the problems that people have with evolution is that we evolved from chimpanzees and gorillas, right? But did we evolve from chimpanzees and gorillas? What's the better way to think about this? I would ask like this too. Okay, so here's you. Well, I'll do this me. I'll make it real personal. Here's me. Here's all my menagerie of siblings, half brothers and half sisters. I don't know how you draw that on here. All right, we go down. Here is my parents. All right, here's my grandparents. Here's my aunts. Here's their children. So that would make us what? First cousins, right? Here's my cousin. Am I descended from my cousin? Did I evolve from my cousin? No. Did my cousin and I evolve from my grandparents? Yes. Right? So when people think humans evolved from gorillas, it's just a misconception. Humans and gorillas evolved from an ancestor down the line, which would have been a whole lot more like a human than a gorilla. Right? It says none of those, we probably ate all those other ones. We killed them all because we're so much smarter. So this idea that we evolved from living primates is just like saying that you evolved from your third cousin. Actually, it'd be more like you evolved from your 16th cousin. It's just not a correct interpretation of a phylogeny. Okay. When we talk about, we can also plot on these characteristics. Okay, so for example, we go back here. What are some things that if you plotted the character on here, what are some characteristics, phenotypic characteristics that are shared by monkeys and apes that are not shared by, with reindeer? So what's one thing you can go to the zoo and look and see about these organisms, and they suggest that they are more closely related than with reindeer? What do you guys think? Any primatologists in here?
Reindeers have hooves.
I'm sorry?
They have hooves.
Okay, yeah, they have digits that are not hooves, right? And so that would be a safe assumption, that type of limb, right, makes them, and why do they have those limbs? Because they have the genes for those limbs. Why do they have those genes and they don't? Because it evolved, those genes evolved somewhere over here, and they apply from here forward, okay? So that would be, for primates, it's what we call a derived character. It's present in the gorilla and the monkey, but it's not found in the reindeer. Okay, so that's more, you could think of that as more like a new character, a newer derived character, evolved after the common ancestor. Other characters, and what would be an example of a primitive character in that last phylogeny? What would be a character that's found in all members of the group and it's found in the common ancestor? We got reindeer, monkey, ape.
They all have fur.
They all have hair, presence of hair. Yep. So reptiles have keratinaceous things in their skin that are scales. Birds have keratinaceous things that are feathers. All mammals have keratinaceous things that are hair, right? Tail, backbone, those are all primitive things. Derived things are more present in the newer models, okay? Presence of teeth in mammals and reptiles. Is that new or old? That's a really old one. You can go back to amphibians, they have teeth. You can go all the way back to fishes, they have teeth. So teeth is not a new thing for mammals and reptiles. But the absence of teeth, right, in birds and in turtles is derived, okay? Let me try to draw a phylogeny that will make this apparent to you. Okay, so now I'm going to take this, pirate this, cannibalize it, and it's no longer my family. This is going to be, let's see, birds are related to the dinosaurs, which we'll see later, it's true. Birds are over here. And then we go back down to here, and we have the lizards and snakes over here. Oh, and the crocodiles are over here. Crocodiles, lizards and snakes, and we can go all the way down here, and here's the turtles. All right. And then we can go down here, and would be some type of amphibian, right? And then we can keep going down. I would go all the way down to the bacteria, but that's going to be like over in the lobby someplace, right? And then we have some type of lobe-finned fishes, right? So if we look at teeth, do fish have teeth? Yeah. Teeth. Do amphibians have teeth? Yeah. They applies to everybody. Do turtles have teeth? No. So they actually lost their teeth in this little side shoot. Teeth still are found in lizards and snakes and crocodiles and dinosaurs, but then up here again, secondarily, teeth are lost, right? Why do you suppose teeth are lost in the birds? what is a bird skeleton all designed all about?
How to reduce
Reducing. It's like those little cars that are made to be real fast. They like tear seats out of them and stuff, you know. The absence of teeth is derived in birds. The presence of teeth in these organisms ancestral. Okay. Relative. I'm gonna get it on time. Okay. Now, a specific method of making cladograms. This slide, it has way too many words on it. I hate, as soon as I flash to it, I see like everybody's eyes are just glazing over. So bear with me. We're getting back to pictures. So a cladogram is a type of phylogeny. Okay? This is just like a specific methodology for making this type of phylogeny. Okay. It outlines these things called clades. This is a noun. Clade is a noun. For example, primates is a clade, or amphibians is a clade. Right? It is a group of branches. It's a branch that has a common ancestor in all of the descendant species. Right? And we'll talk a lot about clades as we go through this class. Right? And the clade, this grouping, is defined by the phylogeny. And the phylogeny is a reconstruction of this relatedness. Okay? So we're going to look and see how to actually make these cladograms, how to construct them. We will really focus on this next class. We'll actually make some of these cladograms. Okay, but for now, I'll just kind of describe it. We're going to look at the characters. We're going to determine whether the character for a given group is primitive or derived. Right? We always include this thing called an outgroup. And it's kind of like your control. The outgroup is a comparison. Okay? I'll come back to this when I show you an example. Okay? The outgroup is a comparison. If we want to know what is primitive, we look and see what the outgroup has. The outgroup is a very distantly related group. We know at the beginning. It's very distantly related, so whatever they have is very primitive. Okay? And we use that to determine what characters, for which groups are derived, and based on that, we make our phylogeny or our tree. Okay. Again, don't worry about the specifics of how to do this. We're going to talk about that next time. We'll give you guys some examples, and you guys can work them out. But here's an example. Here are groups. These are different species, loosely defined. Lizard is not a species, but it's a group. Some species of lizard. Here are characters. Right? We're going to use this little invertebrate chordate animal called the lancelet as an outgroup because we know that they're related to all of these other groups, but they're very distantly related. And they're a really old group. So if the lancelet has it, it's primitive. So the lancelet has a notochord. Okay? So everybody that has the notochord is primitive. Okay? The lancelet does not have vertebrae, and everybody else does. The lancelet does not have 4 limbs, neither does the tuna fish. Everybody else does, so they're in this group, right? So everything is compared back to the lancelet. Okay, and we see basically, you can start to see who's more closely related to who because of the similarities we see in the table. Okay, we can see a dog and a chimp both share hair and they share mammary glands. The finch, the crocodile, and the lizard sort of form this group, so on and so forth. Based on these characters, we can then make a phylogeny. Okay. Couple of things to point out. The outgroup is always the first branch. Again, here's that time aspect. Here's deep time. Maybe this would have happened probably 500 million years ago. Okay. There was one group that remained the lancelet, the common ancestors split, and formed all these other groups, right? Evolution of vertebrae. Everybody from here on out has a vertebrae, a vertebral column. They have bony elements surrounding their nerve cord, okay? These are all the tetrapods. They have 4 limbs. The tuna fish does not, so it gets its own branch. All of these organisms are the amniotes, all right? Amphibians don't have an amniotic egg, so they get their own branch, so on and so forth. So now we're layering on the characters with the phylogeny. So we see who's more closely related to who, and we can kind of see why, okay? And we see when these characters pop up in evolutionary history, okay? Then we can see why are birds more closely related to crocodiles, or what's some evidence for this is that they share vertebrae, they share 4 limbs, they share amniotic egg, and they share the presence of the gizzard. Right? There's a lot of other things. They vocalize, they guard their nest, their skulls are similar. Lots of things suggest this relationship here. Okay. So this is a very useful tool in zoology, are these phylogenies. Okay. Now, it can get kind of murky. It can get kind of murky. It gets a little confusing. Because we're making an assumption here. Okay. What is the assumption that why are we assuming that dogs and chimpanzees are more closely related than they are to other groups? According to this phylogeny, what's the characteristic that unites those two relative to all other groups? Well, there's 2 characters actually. Okay, hair and mammary glands. And what's an assumption? The assumption is that this ancestor here, would they have had hair? Yeah. What about this ancestor? No. And what's the assumption is that these 2 share hair because they inherited the genes for hair from this ancestor. Okay, that's just like a basic assumption. Okay, but now we see that's not always a good assumption. Here's 2 hypotheses about the interrelatedness of these groups here. Okay, what is the main difference between these 2 hypotheses? When we look at that, what is the main difference between those hypotheses? Or I should say, what is the hypothesis about the placement of the frog here and why? And what's the relationship of the placement of the frog here and why? Over here, who's the frog most closely related to? Okay, salamander and why?
The lizard.
Yes, the lizard too. But we're going to see that gets kind of murky, but especially this really recent common ancestor. But what is it that makes, what is the characteristic that suggests that frogs and salamanders are close cousins? Well, no, the tail loss tells us why frogs and salamanders are different. So when you put the tail loss on here, it says, okay, that's what differentiates the frog from the salamander. But why are the frogs and salamanders more closely related? This one's kind of like a negative thing, like they are considered closer related because they don't have an amniotic egg, they don't have hair. So they're similar by the lack of something, okay? Over here, who is the frog most closely related to? Who do they share a most recent common ancestor with? The primates, humans and gorillas, right? And according to this hypothesis, which one, or why is why is there a thought that they're most closely related to us? They're more closely related to us than salamanders in this, because of the tail loss, right? So we say, well, I don't have a tail and they don't have a tail, so we must be closer related, okay? Now, these are two different hypotheses. Can we travel back in time machine and say, okay, that no, actually, there's this common ancestor, it diverged into the salamanders and frogs? No, but why do we tend to accept this one more than this one? Because of this idea of parsimony, okay? It's kind of like Occam's razor. The simplest explanation with the fewest assumptions is normally, in the absence of other data, is going to be the best one, okay? And if we look here, what do we have to assume in order for this to happen? Is that if frogs are here, that means that they evolved hair, they evolved amniotic egg, they evolved hair, they lost the hair, and they lost the amniotic egg, right? And they lost the tail. There's too many assumptions. You can just kind of count them on here. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 assumptions. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to pick this one. I use this as an example because I think for most people it's totally obvious that frogs and salamanders are closely related, but the example is just informative to say, well, maybe it's like this. Oh, okay. We don't pick this because it's not that simple. I'll be right back. Hey. Oh, man. Huh? Well, come on in. You want to go? It's not going to happen. Okay. Parsimony. So you're going to make, when we do this on next week, we're going to make different trees, and then we will use this principle to determine which one's the best. Okay? We'll determine which one is the best. Now, how did this happen? That both the frog lost the tail and the humans lost the tail. Okay? Just because you're similar doesn't mean that you are similar because of common ancestry. Okay? Frogs lost the tail because of the way they move, and humans lost the tail because of the way they move. They've lost them separately, independently. One lost it over here, one lost it over there. Okay? If you think about it, the same thing would happen. It's even more complex to describe this. Okay? So that of a homoplasy. It's similar, but not because of common ancestry. Okay? Similar, but not because it was inherited from a common ancestor. They're similar because of evolution. They're similar because you evolve something and then you lose something. Totally different and independently of each other. Okay? Great example of this. This is a marsupial mole that lives in Australia. Here's a placental mole that lives here in the United States. Right? What are the similarities? Short pelage, big diggy feet, little tiny eyes. A lot of similarities, right? Are they similar because they're really close cousins? No, actually, this mole is more closely related to a black bear than it is to this mole, right? Here's the marsupial mole over here. marsupial mammal. They're more closely related to a kangaroo than they are to the placental mole. Here's the placental mole over here. Placental mole is more closely related to a raccoon than it is to the marsupial mole. They independently lost long hair. Their eyes independently shrank down. Their feet independently enlarged. Why? Because they both have the same kind of niche. Evolution has favored over here this new shape and over there, totally separately.
Would it be from where they are living?
Yeah. The environments,
That to their-
the environments favor the development of those characters. And through time, if they have big eyes and they're underground, they're going to get infections and they're going to die. They're not going to breed and carry on those big eyes, right? And we're going to talk about this process more in the future. But this idea of convergence is really fascinating to me. When I went to China and went to Tibet, you see these people there. They have dark skin, they have long hair, they wear cowboy hats, they ride on horses. And I thought, man, they must be like really closely related to American Indians. But totally separately, they live on grasslands, they ride horses, the hat is perfect for riding horses. They have dark skin because they get lots of sun and they need that melanin to absorb the pigments, right? Lots of examples of convergent evolution. Now, homologous features are ones that are similar because they have a common ancestor. Similar by inheritance, okay? So examples of this would be facial expressions between humans and chimpanzees, right? So many homologous things that humans and chimps have, behaviorally, anatomically. We share most of our DNA together too, okay? So we have homoplasies. And now, I don't know, has anyone gotten far enough in the lizard lab to answer this question? We can see in these anoles that you'll study in the lizard lab, we have ones that have really long tails and or short tails and short legs. They live on tree limbs. This one's maybe in Cuba. This one's in Jamaica. We have ones that have really big that live in treetops, right? They're very similar. Are they similar because they're closely related, or are they similar because they live in similar environments and use the same habitats? And we can see that on the phylogeny here gives us the answer. Here's a twig anole, here's a twig anole. Here is a trunk crown, here's a trunk crown, right? So are the two trunk crown ones more closely related to each other? No. The twig ones are not either. These convergently evolved to be similar, okay? Okay. I got this, I got two more. Huge phylogeny of these type of birds. It's a type of Asian bird, was published in 2014. We can see in this both homologous and homoplasious characters. Something homoplasious, this huge head crest. So you see it evolves here in this clade, and it evolves over here in this clade. The common ancestor here almost certainly didn't have a head crest because nobody else has head crests. It evolves here and it evolved there. An example of a homologous character would be this beautiful blue color. This is the male, that's the female. Look at all these blue birds. It evolved here and applies to everybody here on out. Nobody else has blue. Okay, that's homologous. Similar because of common ancestry. And there's other examples here. Okay. Important concept. So as we group things, putting into categories, we need to be able to know that evolutionary history in order to put them into groups. Okay. grouping has to reflect evolutionary history. Why do we put the reindeer and elk together into the family Cervidae? Because they have antlers and they have antlers. So they're in this group and they're on this branch. The impala and the oryx are put into a different family. Why? They have horns and they're on a totally different evolutionary trajectory. So the phylogeny informs the classification. At one point, humans and bats were considered in the same group. Why? Because they have two mammary glands, and that was enough to say that they're in the same group. But that's a homoplasius character. Okay? So we have these three different types of groups. Monophyletic would be this, common ancestor in all of the descendants. Polyphyly would be to say the lorises and tarsiers are in a group because they're nocturnal primates, but you can't leave out this common ancestor, right? This would be like cherry picking from your family to say the Felicas are this person and that person, but not that person. If these two are in a group, this guy's in the same group, right? You can't leave out members. This does not make sense either, because again, you can't leave out all this. If you include this common ancestor, the whole clade has to include all of the members, okay? So you can't categorize things into families and genera and everything using the blue or the red pair or polyphyletic group. Only monophyletic groups are good groups when it comes to classifying animals. So therefore, this grouping called reptiles is not a good group, right? We can't talk about birds, reptiles, and mammals. Why? Because here's the reptiles, right? And they include the birds. Okay, so you either have to talk about reptiles, and then a subgroup of the reptiles would be birds, or you'd have to call this one thing and this another thing, right? So reptiles is not a good grouping, and there's a lot of issues that we see because it's not monophyletic. Okay. Okay, thanks guys, I appreciate your attention. We will see you not for lab next week, but I'll see you in lecture on Thursday. Look out for the videos and yeah.